Hi, everyone. Let's take a few minutes to talk about Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. First published in 1843, The Telltale Heart is one of Poe's best known and most widely read short stories. The surface story is simple enough to be easy to understand by even grade school students. A narrator, whose name, age, and even gender are never revealed, confesses to the murder of an older man. But as with most well-written literary works, there is so much more to this brief story than meets the eye. By the way, as I said, the gender of the narrator is never actually revealed. Literary critics have generally assumed the narrator is a man, and for this discussion we will too. But there's really nothing in the story that indicates the narrator is male, and it could just as easily be a woman. The source for this presentation is Brett Zimmerman. On its surface, The Telltale Heart is the story of a man who's explaining why and how he has killed his elderly roommate. According to literary critic Brett Zimmerman, one question that is posed by this story is what is the narrator attempting to accomplish by telling his story? Zimmerman points out that it's clear that he's speaking to someone as opposed to writing in a journal, because at the beginning of the story he uses the pronoun you, which implies an audience, and hearken, which means listen. But we know the narrator isn't telling the story simply to confess his crime, as Zimmerman notes. He's already confessed before beginning to tell his story. We know that because the narrator relates what happens when he confesses to the police at the end of the story. Also, at no point in the story does he ever proclaim his innocence, so we know that that isn't his goal. But although it's obvious the story isn't meant to be a confession, it's clear that he's trying to persuade his audience of something because the narrator employs the conventions of classical persuasion in his story, according to Zimmerman. In fact, the story can be broken down into sections that are similar to those of a legal defense, although Zimmerman says it's unlikely that he is actually defending himself in a court of law. If the story is structured as a persuasion, and the narrator is not confessing to police or defending himself in court, what is the narrator attempting to persuade his audience of? He certainly isn't trying to persuade anyone that he's innocent. He admits from the beginning that he has killed the old man, as Zimmerman points out. The narrator also doesn't appear to be attempting to avoid legal consequences for committing murder, Zimmerman states. After all, the confession of the murder that he offers so freely is directed to police officers at the end of the story, so he knows that he has already brought the specter of legal consequences down on his head. What then is he trying to persuade us to believe? Zimmerman maintains that the narrator's motive for telling the story is that he wants to convince his audience that his actions are reasonable and can be comprehended in terms of normal human motivation. His primary concern, as indicated by the very first sentence in the story, is that we understand that even though he has an unnamed illness, he is not mad, Zimmerman indicates. Now, in many of his works, including The Telltale Heart, Poe demonstrates that the mad don't always appear to be unstable at all times, according to Zimmerman. While at times they might display symptoms such as hysterical ravings or highly disorganized thought patterns, they often can behave as others behave. Their speech might appear to be rational, at least on the surface. It might be well organized and even employ the conventions of those who are educated in classical rhetoric. The Telltale Heart is an excellent example of how a narrator's attempts at persuasion can backfire. As Zimmerman argues, Even though the narrator's speech patterns lend him an appearance of sanity, it's a sign of his insanity that he doesn't understand that his actions speak louder than his words, and that his attempts to prove that he is not mad simply help confirm that he is. The irony of the story is that his attempt to convince us that his actions are comprehensible in terms of normal human motivation convinces us of the opposite. His statements that he had loved the old man, that the old man had never treated him badly, and that he didn't want the old man's money eliminate most of the motives for murder that would be part of normal human motivation. A cloudy eye is not a normal human motivation to commit a murder. The narrator's madness is proven by his stated motivation and is confirmed by his inability to understand that his stated motivation is not one that would be comprehensible in terms of normal human behavior. Therefore, his persuasive speech has the opposite effect of his intention because it is based on delusional thinking. The story itself is as much an indication of the narrator's madness as the motiveless murder that it relates, despite the fact that his intention for telling the tale is exactly the opposite. I think that gives us something new to think about in regard to this story that we know so well. As with Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, we see that questioning a narrator's motivation for telling a story the way he tells it can lead to new layers of understanding. And the more ways we can view any work of art, the more interesting it becomes. Now, as you know, if you have any questions or comments, I'm always anxious to hear them. All you need to do is drop me an email through Canvas. Until we talk again, work hard, but also take plenty of time for play.